Welcome back to Warhammer. Tonight we're doing a breakdown on the current state and affairs of the Imperium and all the dangers it faces. As always, I want to thank you guys for the support. Y'all have been killing it. Be sure to like and comment any topics, ideas, videos you want to see in the future. Be sure to subscribe for the Imperium. And last but not least, be sure to check out the merch in the description below. Now, let's get into the video.
They name this age the Dark Imperium, though such a title is a feeble thing for what has truly befallen mankind. In the closing centuries of the 41st millennium and the faltering dawn of the 42nd, reality itself split like overstrained armor, and the old scars of the species were laid open to the void. For 10,000 years, the Imperium had rotted in slow motion, a decay so gradual that even its own custodians mistook it for endurance. Then the sky tore. The cicatrix maledictum bled across the galaxy, a wound of living madness, and the vast edifice of the Imperium was revealed for what it had become. Not a golden empire, but a cadaver propped upright by habit, terror, and an ocean of skulls. Once, in the radiant lie of the Great Crusade, it had been otherwise. There are records still, sealed in vaults beneath the throne world, and in data vaults hidden under mountains of administratum parchment, that speak of a secular age of reason and conquest. In those days the master of mankind walked among his legions in the flesh, a warlord and a lawgiver, a being who spoke of unity and order, not worship and sacrifice. He forged his sons as weapons to bring the fractured shards of humanity back together beneath a single standard. It was never a gentle dream, but it had, in its cold and merciless way, a certain terrible clarity. Worlds were liberated, not merely tithed. Compliance was imposed, not sanctified. There was no imperial creed, no shrieking priesthood, no endless litany of martyrdom. There was only war in the name of a future that might, in some distant age, have known peace. That future lies dead and cold, along with the dreamer who conceived it. The empire that calls itself the Imperium of Man bears the same sigil, fights beneath the same aquila, wields many of the same weapons, but it is a different creature entirely. It is a fanatical theocracy, a labyrinth of rusted mechanisms and ossified traditions, a nation that worships a god who never wanted worship. Its people live and die in fear of inquisitors and confessors, of planetary governors and distant tithes, of the ever-present threat of heresy whispered behind every door. Even its returned son, the Lord Commander of the Imperium, looks upon it with something that is part outrage, part despair. To his eyes, this is not the rational colossus he helped build, but a bloated, rotting carcass that somehow refuses to fall, its limbs twitching in endless spasms of war. That carcass spans 1,000,000 worlds, or so the old formula insists. The truth cannot be known. For every world correctly recorded in the stacks of the administratum, another lies misnamed, mistranslated, or forgotten. Data is a weapon in the Imperium, hoarded and falsified as often as it is used, and yet even in their confusion the scribes agree on the scale. Human life is poured out across the stars in quantities so vast they defeat the imagination. The Astra Militarum raises regiment after regiment from hive. Cities and agri-moons, stripping continents of youth to feed the front lines. The Adeptus Astartes, those gene-forged sons of the Primarchs, fight their wars in more focused numbers, but even they are now legion upon legion, the old strictures of the Codex diluted by the necessities of survival and by the legionary pride of chapters that never entirely broke from their parent legions. Billions march and die so that sector boundaries can be redrawn in a way that satisfies the charts of Lord Militant and High Lord alike. Out in the void between those burning worlds, uncounted void ships drift and burn. There are battle fleets of hundreds of vessels, cathedral-hulled battleships drifting through debris fields of torn plating and frozen dead. There are pilgrim convoys, each ship crammed with the faithful, praying in unison as they pass within sight of the great wound in the sky. There are Mechanicus explorator fleets, their machine spirits howling in binary as they pick through the ruins of dead systems for scraps of forgotten technology. Each ship is a world in itself, a hive of crew decks and manufactoria, gun decks and reliquaries, servitor pens and chapel shrines. Each is a tiny, rotting reflection of the greater empire, plagued by the same hunger, the same fear, the same grinding sense of inevitable doom. In such an age, victory itself has been redefined. Once, in the days of the Great Crusade, compliance was measured in banners raised and oaths sworn, in the glittering lists of new worlds brought into the fold. The records from that time, when they are not carefully redacted, speak of campaigns that ended, of crusades with clear goals and clear resolutions. In the Dark Imperium, there are no such luxuries. A campaign that annihilates an entire subsector may be marked as a triumph if a single vital shrine world endures to pay its tithe of grain and flesh. An invasion that grinds down a tendril of a hive fleet at the cost of 10 or 100 worlds is lauded as a miraculous deliverance, an exterminatus order that sears every life from the surface of a planet rather than let it fall to the enemy, is inscribed in the Book of Judgment as a righteous act of purification. Winning no longer means that humanity advances. Winning means that the latest catastrophe is confined, that the neighboring systems are still capable of screaming for aid when the next one arrives. To understand why the Imperium has reached this state, one must look back beyond the tearing of the Great Rift, beyond even the long age of apostasy, and the wars of faith that scarred the star maps for centuries. One must go back to the Siege of Terror, to the heresy that bears the name of the War Master who betrayed his father. The Great Crusade died there, amidst the ash storms of the throne world and the shattered ring of orbital plate around it. The Emperor was enthroned upon his golden engine of agony, neither alive nor truly dead, his mortal body ruined, his grand design shattered. The legions were broken, the traitors hurled into the warp or driven to the fringes. What followed was not a continuation of the same empire under a new administrator. It was a hasty and desperate improvisation, a patchwork of laws and traditions designed to prevent a second heresy rather than to fulfill the original dream. Every safeguard added another chain, every compromise drove another nail into the coffin. The Codex Astartes split the legions into chapters and bound them in oaths and strictures, but did not purge their pride. The ecclesiarchy grew from the need to channel the fervor of the masses, but its priesthood quickly learned that their power depended on ignorance and fear, not enlightenment. The Inquisition was created to root out heresy and alien corruption, and soon learned that the surest way to erase the stain of failure was to erase the witnesses along with it. 10,000 years of these small, necessary betrayals accumulated until the Imperium itself was a monument to them, a civilization that had forgotten what it had been built to do, and could only remember what it was terrified of becoming again. When the cicatrix maledictum tore the galaxy open from one horizon to the other, it was tempting for many to speak of it as a singular disaster, a moment of cosmic malice when the gods of the warp struck a blow against real space. In truth, it was as much symptom as wound. The currents of the warp are shaped by thought and belief, by the screaming psychic output of uncounted billions of minds. For 10,000 years those minds had been marinated in terror, in hypocrisy, in the endless cycles of war and self-destruction that characterized the Imperium. The galaxy had long been a cauldron of cults, demonic incursions, heresies, and atrocities. The Great Rift was the boil that finally broke the skin, the visible manifestation of corruption that had seeped into every layer of human civilization. It was inevitable that the barrier between realities would tear somewhere. It was almost merciful, in a bleak way, that it tore in a single titanic wound, instead of in 1,000 smaller rents that would have shredded the map beyond any repair. The consequences of that rending went beyond the obvious blossoming of warp storms and demonic fleets. The most insidious damage was done to time itself. For millennia, the Imperium had wrestled with the vagaries of warp travel, with time dilation and lost fleets, with the chronic uncertainty that plagued any attempt to maintain an accurate calendar across 1,000,000 worlds. There were always discrepancies, always systems that thought themselves a year or a century ahead or behind the throne world. After the Dark Imperium dawned, that uncertainty metastasized into something far worse. Noctis Eterna, the long night when the Astronomicon was choked to a flickering ember, shattered what little coherence imperial dates still possessed. Fleets emerged from the warp bearing reports of events that, according to other sources, had not yet occurred, or that had happened and been forgotten generations before. Entire crusades vanished into corridors of empiric turbulence and reappeared in star systems that had never heard their names. The Ordo Chronos, that peculiar branch of the Inquisition which concerned itself with the flow of time and the integrity of causality, tore itself to pieces, trying to reconcile the contradictions. What became known as the Chronos Strife raged in cloistered archives and on hidden battlefields, as inquisitors and their followers killed one another over the question of what year it was, over which accounts of past events should be declared canonical and which should be expunged. To an outsider, such disputes might seem abstract, a luxury for scholars. In the Imperium, where authority rests on the myth of unbroken continuity from the age of the Emperor's direct rule, the question of when something happened is as lethal as the question of whether it happened at all. Into this fractured nightmare walked the avenging sun. Robert Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines, recovered from stasis and thrust into an epoch that should never have existed. He had left a burning but coherent empire behind him, bruised by heresy, but still malleable. He returned to find a theocracy drunk on its own myths, a state that prostrated itself before the image of his father as a god, even as its institutions devoured the people they pretended to shepherd. He saw a labyrinth of bureaucracy so bloated that it threatened to smother any attempt at rational governance, and yet, like a rusted ancient engine forced into motion by sheer inertia, the Imperium still moved. It could still call forth a crusade of 1,000 ships. It could still raise entire planetary populations in arms at the bark of a single tithe order. It could still, at terrible cost, annihilate any threat that presented itself plainly enough. The Lord Commander's horror lies not merely in the cruelty and stupidity he witnesses, though there is more than enough of both to poison any mind not armored by superhuman will. It lies in the realization that this monstrosity is all that stands between humanity and oblivion. The same lunatic faith that fuels the ecclesiarchy also steals billions of soldiers to die in his name without hesitation. The same bureaucratic machine that strangles worlds with its demands can, when whipped hard enough, channel unimaginable resources towards a single necessary war. The same ignorance that keeps the masses pliable also shields them from the more subtle corruptions of the warp. Guilliman walks among shrines built to his father's divinized corpse and sees in them both the chains that bind the species and the armor that protects it. In the end, that is the current problem of the Imperium. It is too vast to steer cleanly, too diseased to heal without killing the patient, too essential to be allowed to die. Every world is a battlefield, every hive city a powder keg, every shrine both a bulwark and a prison. Billions are born only to be harvested into uniform and hurled into the meat grinders of distant campaigns whose names they will never learn, their blood buying a few more years of precarious stability for worlds they will never see. Their sacrifices are recorded in data ledgers that moulder in vaults no one opens, their skulls added to pyramids that impress visiting ecclesiarchs and inquisitors. This rotting colossus lurches on because it must. If it falls, there is nothing waiting to replace it but the open jaws of alien hive fleets, the cold hunger of awakening necron dynasties, the howling laughter of the dark gods. In the dark age that now enfolds the galaxy, the Imperium of Man is both the problem and the only imperfect answer. A dying tyrant whose flailing keeps greater monsters at bay for just a little longer. They first saw the wound as a line of fire across the firmament, an ugly, ragged thing that refused to behave like a natural nebula or storm. On 1,000 worlds, men and mutants, soldiers and serfs, stepped out beneath polluted skies and looked up at unfamiliar constellations broken by a smear of impossible color. It widened with every passing year. A gash of empiric fury slashed through the night until it spanned the galaxy from one spinning rim to the other. The Cicatrix Maledictum, they named it in the high tongue of scholars and penitents, but most simply called it the Great Rift. It was no single storm, no isolated howl of the warp. It was a chain of overlapping, ever-shifting tempest regions, each one a nightmare large enough to swallow sectors whole, all linked together into a single continent of madness burning across the void. The rift was born of failure and of triumph, depending on which side of the war one stood. It flowered in the aftermath of the 13th Black Crusade, when the traitor fleets of the Despoiler hurled themselves once more against the Cadian Gate. Cadia died as it had lived, breaking under a burden that would have crushed lesser worlds in earlier ages. Planetary shields failed, continent-wide trench lines were reduced to slag, and the proud bastions of the Cadian shock troopers were ground beneath the treads of corrupted engines. When the world finally fractured, wrenched apart by the unnatural gravitational agony of a planet killer dragged down into its mantle, the wound did not stop at the planet's surface. Reality buckled. The tides of the warp roared through the break. What had once been a constrained passage, however dangerous, ballooned outward into a gulf of shrieking unreality. The Cadian Gate fell. In its place was an open door into hell. Where that wound crossed the old star charts of the Imperium, it did more than obscure lines upon parchment. It cut the realm in two. In the ages before the rift, the Imperium had been a sprawling, inconsistent thing, with tenuous links between far-flung segments, but it had been one. Messages, fleets and tithes could, in theory, travel from any world to Terra, given enough time and sacrifice. After the rift's birth, that unity ended. The half of the galaxy that still lay beneath the direct glow of the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon bound to the ruined body of the Emperor on his golden throne, became known as Imperium Sanctus. The other half, cast into the shadow beyond the wound where the beacon's light was a rumor at best, became Imperium Nihilus, the Dark Imperium given more terrible meaning and form. To dwell in Imperium Sanctus is to live in a mad tyranny, but at least in one whose masters are dimly visible. Navigators can still open their third eyes and see the distant pulse of the throne world's beacon. Astropaths can still, with sufficient expenditure of souls and sanity, push signals through the storms to reach distant systems. Crusade fleets can be dispatched with an expectation, however faint, that they will emerge. In roughly the era intended, Sanctus is not safe. Its worlds burn, its shrine cities are besieged by alien war hosts and demon tides, its hives erupt into civil war. Yet there is still a sense, in the feverish prayers of its congregations, that terror is there, that the galaxy still has a center, a point of reference around which the whole nightmare revolves. In Imperium Nihilus there is no such comfort. Here the light of the Astronomicon is reduced to embers or is gone entirely, devoured by the pulsing heart of the rift. Navigators who dare open their warp eyes see only churning darkness and the vast leering shapes of things that have never known a mortal shape. Many go blind or mad. Others die as their brains are scoured clean by visions. Without their guidance, starships flounder, crawling along perilous, half-understood currents, or making short, terrified hops between feeble local beacons. Astropathic choirs scream until their throats and minds rupture, their messages shredded into nonsense by the storms. Weeks of chanting and self-mutilation may produce a single word at the other end of the chain, or nothing at all. A distress call might arrive after the world that sent it has already fallen, or centuries before the events it describes take place. Commanders in Nihilus learn to trust local augury and old-fashioned scouts more than any distant instruction. The result of this blindness is isolation, and isolation in the Imperium is a breeding ground for lunacy. There are worlds in the Dark Imperium that have not heard a clear message from Terra since the rift tore the sky, and thanks to the nightmares of warp time, those gaps can amount to subjective centuries. Their governors have fortified and rationed, raised local levies, burned witches and suspected witches, and watched the dark between the stars for the glow of approaching engines. Many have assumed that the rest of the Imperium is dead. Others have come to believe that they are the last true custodians of the Emperor's will, and that the silence from beyond the rift is proof of their special favor. Faith, stretched over such gulfs, distorts. On some of these worlds, new creeds have swollen like tumors from the carcass of the old imperial cult. There are shrine planets where the corpse of a particularly charismatic cardinal or planetary governor has been enthroned in a lesser echo of Terra, his bones wired into life support engines, fed by planetary tithes of blood and souls. There are hive cities where the Adeptus Arbites has fused with remnants of the Astra Militarum to form a hereditary warrior caste, answering only to laws that are several ages out of date, interpreting their faded edicts with lethally creative zeal. There are feral worlds where a long-dead space marine captain has become a god of the hunt, his rusting warplate enshrined in a cave, while tribesmen daub their faces in ash and oil to emulate his helm. All of these cultures swear they serve the Emperor. Many would gladly slaughter an imperial crusade force that arrived and dared to tell them otherwise. Time, always a treacherous thing in a galaxy that travels through the warp, becomes a weapon in this context. On one Nihilus fortress world, the defenders may endure generations of siege under a xenos blockade or a demonic infestation, their calendars ticking through century after century of hunger and plague. On another world, separated by only a few thousand light-years and a particularly malignant fold of the rift, the same interval may pass as little more than a decade. A relief fleet might launch from Imperium Sanctus, brave a flickering corridor through the storms, and arrive at its destination to find the world already reclaimed by its own fanatics, or completely glassed by any earlier, more desperate imperial task force. In other cases, a crusade might arrive to answer pleas for aid that were sent by men whose great-grandchildren are now old and embittered, their lives built upon the assumption that help will never come. No one can coordinate a grand strategy across such chaos. At best, there can be reactive campaigns, attempts to plug the worst leaks in a hull already half underwater. The geography of the Great Rift is not fixed. Its storms expand and contract, its shoals of relative calm drift. But there are a handful of regions where the tides have, thus far, proven less murderous. These half-stable routes are precious beyond measure. The Imperium names them, studies them, fortifies them. These corridors become the arteries through which crusade fleets, Mechanicus expeditions, and refugee armadas attempt the crossing between Sanctus and Nihilus. For that very reason, they are killing grounds. Chaos warlords linger there, their fleets hanging like predators in the shallows, ready to fall upon any vessel that emerges wounded from the other side. Ork warbands, drawn by the sheer density of potential battle, prowl the same zones in patchwork. Hulks, demonic armadas appear and vanish according to logics no sane mind can map, turning safe passage into sudden, screaming death. To move 1,000 ships through such a corridor is to accept that a substantial portion will never reach the far side. Even in Imperium Sanctus, where maps can still be drawn with some hope of predictability, the administrative machinery strains and buckles under the stresses imposed by the rift. The administratum still issues its tithe demands based on archives that may or may not have survived the storms. On parchment and noospheric slate, a world might be listed as verdant and loyal, owing a quota of grain, ore and regiments. In reality, that planet may have been devoured by a hive fleet, its systems stripped of all organic matter down to bacteria. Another world may have fallen to insurrection, its manufactoria churning out weapons for a new, self-proclaimed protectorate that has no intention of shipping anything elsewhere. Yet the demands go out, and when the quotas are not met, punitive expeditions are planned, all on the basis of data that drifted so long in the warp that it should have been declared myth. So much effort is wasted chasing ghosts, punishing corpses, or trying to resurrect supply lines to worlds that now exist only as half-remembered curses. The forges and hives of Imperium Sanctus feel this waste keenly. They are the ones who must raise additional regiments to compensate for those lost to ambushes in the crossing corridors. They must increase their output of tanks, lasguns and rations to arm and feed fleets that will spend subjective years limping through the Empyrean, only to arrive at objectives that may have ceased to be relevant. The shrine worlds of the inner Imperium, once content to bask in a steady tide of pilgrims and tithes, now find themselves pressed into more direct service. Their cathedrals become recruitment grounds, their reliquaries emptied of sacred relics that are broken down into relic, blades and anointed bolter shells to inspire beleaguered troops. The nobles of the core sectors discover that their ancient rites and customs are suddenly subject to ruthless override by the Lord Commander's agents, who care little for tradition when there is a crusade to sustain. Even here, under the nominal light of the throne, the sense of being stretched too thin to endure much longer is palpable. If the Great Rift had simply been a barrier, a wall of madness separating two halves of the Imperium, it would have been horror enough. It is worse than that. The rift is also an open artery, a pulsing vein from which the blood of the warp pours into real space. Demonic incursions that once required a complex web of cult worship and rare astronomical alignments can now breach the walls of reality with appalling ease wherever the wound's edges glitch and flutter. Chaos armadas use the turbulence to slip unpredictably into what were once thought secure rear areas, materializing above. Agri-worlds and minor forge moons that had been considered safe enough to strip of their defenses. Warp-tainted plagues drift out of the rift on invisible currents, seeping into station habdecks and underhive slums, warping flesh and faith alike. The line between front and rear, battlefield and home ground, has blurred to almost nothing. In this new order, the Imperium is no longer a single, if rotten, structure groaning under its own weight. It is two separate, diverging civilizations, each mutating in response to its position relative to the wound in the sky. Imperium Sanctus clings to the illusion of continuity, its hierarchs insisting that the old rules still hold, even as they cut them to pieces for expedience. Imperium Nihilus teeters on the brink of permanent schism, its worlds reshaping the imperial creed and the very idea of loyalty and isolation, bound together more by common enemies than by any coherent central command. Neither half possesses the strength, the unity, or the clarity of purpose to save the other. The Great Rift is not merely a strategic challenge or a cartographer's nightmare. It is the central structural failure of the age, a break not only in space and time, but in the idea of the Imperium itself, a wound that no crusade, no matter how vast, can ever truly close. There was a time when imperial strategists comforted themselves with the notion of an age defined by a single great enemy. Once it had been the War Master and his rebels, and the entire machinery of the nascent Imperium had turned to face that one treacherous spearhead. Later, other threats had risen in turn, ghastly but isolated, and the chronicles of those ages were written as if each horror was the primary story of its century. In the era that followed the tearing of the Great Rift, such certainties dissolved. The current age of mankind is not the age of one foe, but of all of them at once. Chaos seethes along the wounds in the sky. Tyrannid hive fleets curve in from the intergalactic dark like barbed hooks. Ork empires swell and burst in tides of emerald carnage. Necron dynasties rise from under the feet of panicking human populations. Eldari raiders and worse, their fractured cousins, dance along the edges of every war, cutting throats where it matters most. Even the younger xenos polities, once dismissed as regional irritants, now gnaw at the flanks of overstretched imperial borders. Each of these enemies fields forces on the scale of whole sectors. Each is capable, in its own way, of exterminating human life wherever it gains room to breathe. The ascendance of chaos in this epoch is not subtle. The 13th and most recent Great Black Crusade of the Despoiler did not end as so many of its predecessors had, in ruin and retreat. At Cadia, the traitor warbands achieved what they had sought for long ages. The Bastion world broke. In shattering, it helped tear the veil between the material universe and the immaterium, and the Great Rift howled into being. The Despoiler did not march a victorious host upon Terra in the wake of this cataclysm, as some had feared. He did something more insidious. He let the wound fester. His fleets, and those of the many Chaos Lords who owe him only loose allegiance, now prowl the ragged edges of the rift like predators along a bleeding shoreline. From these staging grounds, they launch thrusts into both halves of the Imperium, striking at the weak points revealed by the convulsions of the era. Demon worlds multiply behind them like cancers, each one a forge of new abominations and fresh crusades against reality. In the corewood realms of the Ultima Segmentum, the realm of Ultramar became the proving ground for what it means to fight such an enemy while the galaxy is already on fire. When the Lord Commander led his first great wave of crusade fleets out from Terra, he left behind his old domain as a stable anchor, a bastion of order in the storm. Nurgle, the Plague Lord, saw an opportunity in that. Pride. The demon Primarch Mortarion brought his legion of the Death Guard and a host of lesser demon engines and warbands against Ultramar in a methodical, festering invasion that Imperial scholars would later term the Plague Wars. What followed were not brief campaigns, but grinding years of war in which garden worlds were choked with corpse flies, fortress moons became ringed with pox-bloated wrecks, and entire systems were reduced to diseased ruin rather than surrendered. The Ultramarines, their successors, and scores of other chapters bled themselves to hold those borders, tying down so many of the Imperium's greatest assets that other regions of space were left dangerously exposed. This is the pattern now. A single demon Primarch can command enough force to consume decades of effort from dozens of chapters, entire segmentum fleets, and more mortals than any ledger can track, simply to prevent the complete annexation of one cluster of worlds into some obscene parody of a garden. While that war festers, while Guilliman is drawn back to confront his diseased brother, other fronts slip and tear elsewhere. Chaos does not fight as a monolith, but as a swarm of rival lords and cults, each pursuing its own blasphemous ambitions. Yet viewed from the bleak vantage of Terra's strategium, that very incoherence becomes a kind of strength. There is no single head to cut off, no single banner to topple. Kill one demon Primarch, and another moves. Crush one Black Legion spearhead, and a word-bearer crusade, or 1,000 suns cabal blooms in a different quadrant. The dark gods are patient, and the fractures in the Imperium are many. As if the endless storms of chaos were not enough, the galaxy must also contend with foes that have no stake in the warp's temptations at all. From beyond the mortal stars come the Tyranids, extragalactic predators, whose motives can be reduced to one word that even an underhive scummer can understand: hunger. The Imperium has already named 3 great conflicts the Tyrannic Wars, each one a brutal education in just how vast a hive fleet's appetite can be. The first saw Behemoth crash against Macragga and leave entire regions stripped to rock and dust. The second, Kraken, taught Imperial commanders that the creatures can split and faint, sending multiple tendrils to carve away whole arms of the galaxy. The third, Leviathan, revealed itself as larger still, surging up from beneath the galactic plane in a scissor movement that threatened to catch the Imperium between its jaws. Each time, the defenders declared victory when they managed to break or redirect a tendril, or to hurl a swarm into some other grinder like the Ork empires of Octarius, but in truth each so-called victory merely delayed the inevitable. Now there is talk of a 4th great tyrannic war, the greatest yet, as the shattered but unspent bulk of Leviathan hurls itself once more against human-held space. This time its tendrils reach towards the vulnerable western reaches of the Segmentum Pacificus, deliberately seeking those regions where Imperial attention is fixed elsewhere by the rift's spawn. Above and below the galactic plane, new skeins of bioships close in like claws, designated with new code names by desperate Navy cartographers who know, even as they ink them onto the star charts, that these labels will soon be obsolete. Each tendril is a mobile ecosystem of predation, capable of learning from past defeats, altering its genetic arsenal on the march. A tactic that worked once may fail catastrophically when tried again. A weapon that burned through chitin in one war may find itself fouled and useless in the next, as the creature's armor grows new layers in answer. Where a hive fleet advances, worlds die. Not 1 or 2, not in the measured attrition that marks most other campaigns, but in gouting sequences of annihilation that can erase entire subsectors from the maps. Imperial doctrine in such theatres speaks of layered defense lines, of sacrificial guard worlds and fortress systems designed to bleed away each wave of the swarm. In practice, that means raising tens of billions of guardsmen, shipping them to planetary trench lines that stretch from horizon to horizon, and telling them they will die buying time. Behind them stand Astartes' strike forces, night houses, Titan maniples, and the cold voxes of Navy admirals, calculating how much biomass can be affordably sacrificed before they must cut their losses and abandon the region entirely. In the skies, bioships duel with battle fleets, spewing mycetic spores and boarding creatures that turn corridors into tunnels of bone and pulped flesh. On the ground, the very atmosphere becomes weaponized, clouds of digestive toxins and spore blankets eating through machinery and men alike. At the end, assuming there is an end, a world may be left as a grey husk, all oceans drunk, every forest and hive scraped clean. It is triumph if the hive fleet fails, to move on to the next world in good order. Even this gluttony of horrors would be easier to account for if the Tyranids were the only xenos empire pressing at the gates. The Orks, the brutal green tide that has plagued the Imperium since before its founding, have never needed an excuse to go to war. They are war. In the Dark Imperium, they are more numerous than ever. Warlords of grotesque size rise in the shadows of the Great Rift and on its neglected fringes, gathering hordes whose numbers defy rational tally. Each Ork war is war elevated to a kind of insane ritual, a psychic and physical avalanche that rolls from world to world. Human chroniclers speak of them in the same breath as natural disasters, because that is how they feel to those on the ground. City-sized scrap hulks fall from the sky trailing gouts of fire. Clan banners the height of hab blocks are raised atop mountains of skulls. Ork artillery turns continents into overlapping impact craters where seas used to be. The greenskins themselves revel in the carnage, growing larger and more cunning as the slaughter continues. their collective psychic field turning crude weapons into instruments of mass extinction. Imperial commanders have, at times, sought to use Ork hunger as a tool, directing hive fleets and Ork empires into collision in places like the accursed Octarius region, in the mad hope that the two horrors might annihilate each other and spare mankind the effort. The reality is that such maneuvers simply create new, uncontrolled storms of war whose outcomes cannot be predicted. Every guardsman tied down watching an Ork front, every battle group pinned by a rising Wa, is one that cannot be spared to face Leviathan or the despoiler elsewhere. To lower vigilance against the greenskins is to invite them to overflow their current killing grounds and spill into new, softer territories. Beneath and beyond these more obvious tides of flesh and fury, a colder, more methodical enemy is also on the move. The necrons, ancient machine dynasties that predate humanity by spans of time that mock mortal history, are stirring in ever greater numbers. Tomb worlds that were long catalogued as dead relics, or that were never catalogued at all, are awakening as their masters rouse from eons of stasis. In some regions, overlords like the dread Stormlord conduct absorption wars, campaigns aimed not at human systems, but at rival necron holdings, as they seek to rebuild their fractured empires. In others, dynasties quietly flick a series of switches buried far beneath the crust of planets that humans believe they own, shutting down star lanes, silencing astropathic relays, and extinguishing orbital infrastructure with surgical precision. Sometimes an Imperial garrison has the chance to fight and die against advancing phalanxes of living metal and crackling gorse fire. Often they simply vanish, their worlds falling silent, as if a god had pinched out a candle. Administratum clerks, staring at their ledgers, find that the numbers attached to those worlds have become meaningless. The tithes no longer arrive. A mark is made beside the name. Investigation is requested. The request joins the backlog, where the necrons do not so much destroy as unmake, lowering a creeping shroud of anti-warp nullity over whole regions. The old Eldar races exploit the resulting confusion. Craft world war hosts, sleek and elusive, strike key Imperial worlds when they are most vulnerable, often with the explicit intention of denying resources to tyrannids or chaos, rather than fighting for or against mankind itself. Their seers read skeins of fate that stretch beyond human comprehension, and do not hesitate to sacrifice billions of human lives to avert futures that only they can see. Their piratical kin among the Drukhari raid into hive cities and shrine worlds to harvest slaves and souls, gutting the command structures of regiments and planetary governments with pinpoint strikes that centuries of painstaking propaganda cannot easily repair. Harlequin troops appear in the midst of crucial battles to kill a single general or destroy a single artifact, then vanish again, their motives as opaque as ever. To the Imperium, these raids are pinpricks compared to the great wars of attrition, but they bleed away the officers, psychers, and relics that might otherwise have turned the tide in some other, more conventional war. On the fringes, other predators circle. The Tau Empire, youthful and zealous, pushes its borders outward whenever Imperial vigilance lapses, offering what it calls enlightenment and unity in place of the Emperor's harsh embrace. In some regions, human governor houses fracture, as factions argue over whether to fight or join the blue-skinned diplomats at their gates. Civil wars split worlds before a single shot is fired at the alien. Elsewhere, lesser xenos species, once penned into marginal systems, surge into the vacuums left by hive fleets and wags, creating yet more microfronts for the beleaguered Imperium to consider. Faced with this landscape of unending threat, the Lord Commander's war councils resemble less the sweeping campaigns of the Great Crusade, and more the frantic efforts of a surgeon triaging a patient who is bleeding from every limb and organ.
Remember, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Support helps.
In the Strategium, hololithic star maps glow with thousands of scarlet runes, each denoting a war zone, an uprising, a siege, a demonic incursion, a newly awakened tomb, or a fresh report of a hive fleet's shadow. Around each cluster of light, senior officers and chapter masters argue, their voices sharpened by the knowledge that every decision condemns countless souls. To reinforce one front is to abandon another. A corridor through the great rift that allows supplies to reach half a dozen embattled sectors may be judged more vital than an entire backwater subsector where a hive fleet has begun to feed. A forge world producing irreplaceable plasma reactors may be saved at the price of 3 agri-systems whose starvation will be felt in a century when their tithe shortfalls doom some other campaign. No one speaks of victory. They speak of buying time. Even the Indomitus crusade, that greatest mustering of imperial force since the age when the emperor walked in the flesh, is constrained by this arithmetic. Its fleets are immense, its primaris reinforcements potent, its initial advances glorious in the eyes of imperial propagandists, but it cannot be everywhere. Every time the crusade armadas break a chaos siege, or burn a tendril of tyrannids from the sky, several other threats grow elsewhere unchecked. The crusade stabilizes. It does not resolve. It buys breathing room for worlds that might otherwise have fallen, but it cannot extirpate the roots of any major enemy empire. Chaos, tyrannids, Orks, necrons, Eldar, and the younger xenos nations all retain core territories, core strengths that the Imperium has nowhere near the surplus capacity to invade and annihilate. This is the external face of the Imperium's current problem. The Empire's enemies are too many, too vast, and too entrenched to be wiped away, and the Imperium's own strength, though terrifying by any lesser standard, is finite and fraying. Its armies and fleets can only be shuffled from crisis to crisis, ensuring that no single foe is allowed the space to finish the species off in one decisive blow. The price of holding the line against one apocalypse is always paid in the currency of another. In such a universe, the dream of a final victory is a joke whispered in the quiet hours of chapel vaults. Survival means juggling 1,000 fires and praying that none of them, for a little while longer, becomes the one that burns everything to ash. Robert Guilliman had once helped build an empire of cold reason. He remembered the rallying cries of the Great Crusade as invocations to unity, order, and survival, not to blind faith. Compliance had been demanded, yes, and demanded at the barrel of a bolter, but it had been justified in the language of progress and human destiny. Now, as Lord Commander and unwilling regent, he walked the halls of terror and the star-choked void beyond, and knew that the thing calling itself the Imperium of Man was not that empire. It was the corpse that remained when the dreamer had been nailed to a throne and left to rot. It moved only because the rituals that had grown around its decay demanded endless motion. It killed because killing had become its only language. It sacrificed its own children upon altars built from their fathers' bones and called the pile of skulls a cathedral. Everywhere he went, the imperial cult pressed in like mold on damp stone. There was no corner of the Imperium untouched by its clammy hands. Hive labourers began their shifts with screamed litanies to the God Emperor. Naval crews daubed oils and blood over bulkheads before they dared to engage their warp drives. Planetary governors prostrated themselves in robes grown heavy with devotional metalwork, weeping from the weight as they begged the throne for another century of undeserved survival. The ecclesiarchy presided over it all like bloated carrion birds, their sermons and edicts sinking into every aspect of life. They did not merely provide faith for the desperate, they defined reality. To question the creed was not to doubt a philosophy. It was to be branded a heretic, a blasphemer, an enemy of mankind itself. Guilliman saw, with the clear eyes of a son who had known his father as a man and not as a god, that this cult and its tyrannical hold over thought and word were hideous distortions of the emperor's intent. He also knew that to say so openly would ignite wars that made the Horus heresy look like a border skirmish. The ecclesiarchy's dogma was woven into the foundations of the Imperium's identity. A cardinal on a shrine world could move more men to kill and die with a single sermon than many generals could with an entire campaign plan. On some worlds, the ecclesiastical hierarchy was the only functioning authority left, the administratum fallen into senility, and the local nobility reduced to parasitic irrelevance. Suggesting doctrinal reform to such powers was like asking a hive to soar through the struts that held it above the toxic sea it floated upon. The priests were not the only ones who had come to believe that their institution was the Imperium. In the shadows and the light, the Inquisition worked its will, an organization that had begun as a necessary, ruthless scalpel and become a diseased organ all its own. Its remit was vast, to guard humanity from alien corruption, from demonic infection, from the subtle whisper of heresy that could topple worlds. In that role, it had saved the species 1,000 times over, in battles that would never be spoken of outside sealed chambers. It had also, over the long centuries, turned its gaze inward. The hunters began to hunt one another. Puritan and radical were the names they gave their warring philosophies, though within those camps 100 sub-creeds snarled and clawed. Puritans sought to excise any taint, to burn, purge, and scour until nothing even remotely questionable remained. Radicals argued that to fight such enemies, one must be willing to employ some of their tools, to bind demon hosts, to employ xenos weaponry, to twist the warp's own power back upon itself. Disagreements that might, in another age, have been confined to scathing marginalia in dusty treatises, instead erupted into covert wars. Whole subsectors found themselves under silent siege, as inquisitorial cells turned their resources against one another. Arbeits precincts, PDF regiments, and even Astartes strike forces were drawn into these hidden conflicts, each convinced they were serving the truest vision of the throne by eradicating the other. Planets burned under exterminatus that never appeared in any public record. Star systems were quarantined and left to die because one conclave feared what another might unearth there. The very body charged with safeguarding humanity's soul was gouging chunks from its flesh. Layered atop this doctrinal madness was the slow suffocation of bureaucracy. The administratum, that labyrinth of parchment and cogitators, had always been sluggish. In the age of the Dark Imperium, it had become a kind of predatory environment of its own. Functionaries whose families had occupied the same desk for generations shuffled tithe schedules that were centuries out of phase with reality. Decrees issued during ancient crusades, written to solve forgotten crises, were still being enforced with lethal zeal because no one with the authority to rescind them had ever seen the relevant scroll. The Departamento Munitorum, charged with raising, arming, and supplying the galaxy's armies, treated regiments and war zones as entries in ledgers, not as living entities drowning in blood. It was not malice, not most of the time. It was inertia turned into cruelty, ignorance ossified into law. A besieged frontier world might send desperate pleas for ammunition and reinforcements through the warp and receive. Decades later, a curt rejection, penned by a scribe who believed the world's tithe shortfalls indicated laziness rather than existential battle. Meanwhile, some forgotten backwater, once earmarked as a staging ground for a crusade that never launched, continued to receive shipments of munitions and fresh regiments far in excess of any conceivable need, its warehouses groaning with unused tanks, while 100 real war zones fought with knives and bare hands. To resist such madness was to invite censure. To question the form of an order, even one obviously misapplied, was to be suspected of insubordination or heresy. Better to obey, to shuffle the papers, to sign the death warrants. The snapping of the galaxy's temporal spine only deepened the absurdity. After the Great Rift ripped open the firmament, time itself became suspect. Fleets emerged from the warp bearing accounts of battles that, according to other sources, had not yet happened or had happened centuries before. Generations on one side of the rift lived and died under siege in what felt like unending night, while to observers elsewhere only a handful of Terran years ticked by. In such a context, the attempt to pin dates to events became an exercise in theology as much as in chronometry. The Ordo Chronos, that peculiar wing of the Inquisition that concerned itself with temporal anomalies, found itself at the heart of a new doctrinal war. The Chronostrife, Inquisitors called it, when their muttered contempt boiled over. Arguments over what year it was, over which sequence of events should be considered canonical, escalated into assassinations and purge orders. Entire archives were expunged, their contents declared anathema because they supported the wrong version of the timeline. Savants and lex mechanics were burned alongside witches, their crime not being that they had consorted with demons, but that they insisted on a dating schema that offended some powerful inquisitor's sense of order. Guilliman, who cared for accurate history as a general cares for good maps, watched in disbelief as the Imperium's own elites butchered one another over whether some particular atrocity had occurred before or after some other, equally ghastly one. The truth, he came to realize, mattered less than the illusion of coherence. An empire that could not agree on its past, could not plan its future, but an empire that admitted it did not know its past at all, might simply shatter. Even amongst his own sons, the Lord Commander found discord seeded by the necessities of survival. When he unleashed the Primaris reinforcements, those taller, stronger, more gene-stable warriors, wrought by the coupling of ancient genocraft and Archmagus Call's obsessive hubris, he did so because there seemed no other way to replenish the Imperium's failing elite. The Adeptus Astartes had bled for 10,000 years. Entire chapters had been wiped out or reduced to nominal handfuls. New blood was needed. Yet the sudden arrival of Primaris brethren into old chapters, carrying unfamiliar war gear and bearing alterations the original Primarchs had never authorized, struck like a shockwave. Some chapters welcomed the newcomers with open arms, seeing in them a chance to renew their dwindling numbers and strike harder than ever at the foes of mankind. Others accepted them with wary pragmatism, folding their squads and companies around the new formations, like scar tissue around a graft. Still others resented them deeply, seeing in their imposing frames and tacit connection to Guilliman's reforms an insult to millennia of tradition and sacrifice. Old grudges between chapters, never entirely dormant, flared again, as some accused others of currying favor with terror in exchange for the best. Primaris allotments. In a few dark cases, whispers spread that these towering warriors were not true sons of their supposed genelines at all, but some new breed that would, in time, supplant the old completely. Guilliman had meant to strengthen the shield. Instead, in places, he had driven hairline cracks through it. At the fringes of the Imperium, where the light of the Astronomicon was faint or gone, and the Munitorum's orders arrived garbled, the strain manifested as open rebellion. Chaos cults bloomed in the underhives and manufactoria, promising simple certainties in place of distant, incomprehensible decrees. Rogue governors, tired of being asked to bleed their worlds dry for wars they could neither see nor effect, turned their backs on terror and declared local dominions, some dressing their treason in noble rhetoric about self-determination, others simply indulging in naked tyranny. In Imperium Nihilus, cut off by rift storms and time tides, warlords emerged who no longer even pretended to interpret administratum edicts, They forged pacts with xenos empires, traded with alien merchants, or bowed their heads to demonic patrons in exchange for food and weapons, deciding that these abominations were preferable to starvation under the yoke of an absentee god. Each such break in the chain of loyalty was met, where it was noticed at all, with the same reflex that had come to define the Imperium's habits. Purge. Rebel worlds were marked in red on battle maps. Fleet orders were drafted. Inquisitorial kill teams were dispatched to seed fear and confusion ahead of the main assault. Sometimes, when resources were already stretched to breaking, a single astropathic request to the nearest chapter of the Astartes would suffice. A company or even a single squad of gene-forged warriors could descend, break the back of a rebellion in storm of blood and fire, leave a mountain of corpses and a new compliant governor trembling on a throne, then depart. Other times, when the infection was deemed too deep or too tainted, there was no attempt at surgery. An exterminatus order was signed, the right sigils applied, the machine spirits of cyclonic torpedoes appeased with incense and prayers. A world died to remove a splinter from the Imperium's thumb. Over centuries and then millennia, this habit of reaching for the torch rather than the scalpel had curious effects on Imperial thinking. Loss of life on a scale that would annihilate entire species elsewhere became an accepted cost of doing business. A planetary bombardment that killed every living soul on a world was not seen by those who signed the orders as monstrous. It was seen as tidying up. Faith wars, where rival sects of the imperial creed slaughtered each other's followers across continents or star systems, often claimed more imperial citizens than any xenos raid in the same period, yet were tolerated because to intervene against the ecclesiarchy's chosen side was politically impossible. In the cold calculus of the High Lords, a few 100 billion dead in such campaigns were unfortunate but acceptable if the result was a more stable dogma in that region. Better a unified, obedient flock of fewer souls than a larger population prone to thinking. As Guilliman traced the lines of these internal rot patterns, he saw a grim pattern. The Imperium's great organs of state no longer served the species as a whole. They served themselves. The ecclesiarchy existed to perpetuate the ecclesiarchy, to expand its shrines and its power, to ensure that its particular version of worship drowned out any other. The administratum existed to continue generating and obeying its own paper edicts, an ouroboros of ink and law feeding on itself. The munitorum existed to collect tithes and send them elsewhere, whether or not that elsewhere still existed. The Inquisition existed to root out threats, but had long since begun to define threats in ways that conveniently justified its own growth and secrecy. Each organ fought not only external enemies, but any suggestion of reform as if it were demonic infection. There was, he realized, no painless cure for this sickness. To attempt to secularize the Imperium, to strip back the imperial cult and return humanity to the rational, atheistic vision his father had held, would ignite galaxy-wide faith wars that would tear apart what remained of their military coherence. To dismantle or meaningfully restructure the administratum and munitorum risked collapsing supply chains on which armies at the front depended, however inefficiently those chains functioned. To rein in the Inquisition, to demand transparency from those who had grown used to answering to no one, would provoke purges and schisms whose collateral damage would make the chronostrife look like an academic disagreement. Yet to do nothing, to let the corpse state continue in its present habits, was to guarantee that it would, sooner or later, simply rot through and fall apart under its own weight. The Lord Commander stood in silent chapel vaults, under frescoes that depicted his father as a sun-crowned god hurling thunderbolts at sinners, and understood that he was as much prisoner here as regent. The Imperium could not survive without reform, but it could not endure the convulsions that true reform would bring. Its faith, its bureaucracy, its secret wars, and its reflexive purges were killing it from within, but they were also the only structures still holding it up. Caught in that paradox, the empire of mankind stumbled forward, bleeding and blind, held together by chains that cut ever deeper into its own flesh. Robert Guilliman woke into nightmare and was told it was his father's dream fulfilled. They called him the Avenging Son and placed upon his shoulders the titles of Lord Commander and Imperial Regent. They draped him in robes of state and ancient honors, paraded him through cathedrals whose walls showed him as a saint, kneeling before a sun-crowned god who wore his father's face. Behind the incense and the chants, behind the clamor of cheering millions, he could smell the stink of rot. This was not the ordered, secular empire he had helped to build in the age of great conquest. This was a corpse state, animated by fanatics and butchers, staggering on only because it had forgotten how to lie down and die. He did not have the luxury of turning away. The Imperium was a horror, but it was humanity's horror. Out beyond its fraying borders, the void was filled with things that would not grant his species even the cruel mercy it granted itself. Hive fleets dreamed of nothing but consumption. Orc empires thundered towards apotheosis in endless battles. The ancient machine dynasties were waking with cold hatred in their hollow hearts. The warp howled with demons whose only joy lay in the violation of mortal minds and flesh. Between these predators and the frail mass of humanity stood only this nightmare empire of shrines and guns. Guilliman could not love it. He could not even fully recognize it, but he could not abandon it. To do so would be to damn billions to extinction in a storm that would never end. So he did what his father had made him to do. He launched a crusade. When the indomitus crusade first uncoiled from terror, it did so with the pride and fury of a wounded titan. It was meant as a statement to the galaxy that mankind was not yet finished. Fleet after fleet burned outward from the throne world, banners streaming in the warp winds, their holds packed with newly awakened Primaris Astartes, their decks trembling with the footfalls of mortal regiments drawn from 100 worlds. Battle barges and grand cruisers, black ships and forge hulks, pilgrim convoys converted into troop carriers, and shrine vessels pressed into service as flagships, all were gathered and hurled into the void. The initial thrust cut through Imperium Sanctus like a spearhead of light, punching through chaos-held regions that had festered since the rift opened, relieving sieges that had ground on through years of nightmare. Besieged hive worlds saw their skies fill with the contrails of drop pods. Shrine planets whose defenders had been down to their last munitions watched as fresh regiments in crisp uniforms and gleaming armor disembarked to take their place in the trenches. Forge worlds that had been stripped bare by desperate tithes received new contracts and new protection. Their machine spirits soothed with the promise that they would once more be building for victory rather than simple survival. In time, the Crusade's reach extended beyond the wound in the sky. Through perilous corridors and treacherous warp shoals, Guilliman's armadas forced passage into Imperium Nihilus, bringing the astonishing sight of disciplined, well-supplied imperial fleets into regions that had believed themselves abandoned. On those worlds, the arrival of the Crusade was like seeing a ghost of the Great Crusade itself stride out of legend. Bannered Astartes marched in step with mortal tanks, while the Lord Commander's own flagship loomed above like some ancient myth made metal. The message was simple and brutal. Humanity still lived. It could still bring war on a scale that shook continents and split moons. Scribes on Terra, always hungry to impose narrative on chaos, spoke of the Indomitus Crusade as an era now drawing to a close. They wrote of it as if it were the second coming of the Great Crusade, a finite campaign that would stabilize the Imperium and then end neatly, its victories sealed into the histories. The truth that unfolded in the years and then decades that followed was far less tidy. The first great wave of the Crusade did indeed last roughly a century, by the reckoning of those closest to Guilliman, a brutal span of campaigning that carved a corridor of relative stability through the worst of the storm. Yet even as those initial goals were met, new crises erupted. Worlds that had been relieved fell to fresh invasions. New rifts in the warp opened like sucker mouths along the flanks of the Great Rift. Hive fleets altered course. Ork wars boiled up from previously quiet sectors. The Crusade could not simply stop. It metastasized into a mode of existence. In the present age, to speak of the indomitus crusade as something that will end is to miss its nature. It is no longer a discrete campaign. It is the standing condition of the Imperium. Fleets bearing its sigils continue to depart from mustering worlds, continue to crash into war zones that were not even marked on maps when the banners were first unfurled. Commanders come and go. The Lord Commander himself is forced to direct more and more of its operations from afar, splitting his attention between the front and the festering heart. The Crusade, once trumpeted as a road back to stability, has become the new equilibrium. Permanent emergency, permanent mobilization, permanent war. Even as he throws armies into the furnace at the galactic frontier, Guilliman works at quieter fires. He knows that the enemies outside are only half the problem. Inside the Imperium, the rot of bureaucracy and mad faith is just as deadly. He cannot tear down the great institutions that have grown up in his father's name without ripping out humanity's lungs and spine. He can, however, try to make them choke on fewer of their own victims. He begins with what he understands best, logistics. The Lord Commander walks the echoing archives of the Administratum, a Primarch striding through mountains of parchment, and demands clarity. With the authority of his resurrected blood, he compels ancient departments to talk to one another, to compare tithes and needs, to admit that some worlds are receiving supplies for crusades that ended centuries ago while others starve. He appoints new officials, men he judges to be competent and ruthless in the right ways, and gives them license to cut through layers of redundant edicts. Some of these reformers are assassinated within weeks by those who depended on the old chaos. Others survive long enough to rationalize a supply line or two, saving whole armies from collapse in theaters far away. He does not dare move openly against the ecclesiarchy. His disgust for the imperial cult is a constant low burn in his marrow, but he has seen too many shrines where the only thing standing between worlds and despair is a preacher with a loud voice and a talent for channeling fear into fervor. Instead of confrontation, he chooses flanking maneuvers. He encourages certain cardinals who favor a more disciplined, less extravagantly murderous form of worship, quietly promoting them where he can. He insists that some of the worst excesses of penance and purgation be curtailed in regions already on the edge of collapse. He carefully avoids phrases that might be interpreted as blasphemy, couching his requests in the language of the creed itself. A warlord who once would have been encouraged to burn a third of his population as a warning to the other two-thirds might, under this new dispensation, be persuaded that a well-publicized series of floggings and a renewed tithe schedule will suffice. In the Inquisition, he finds fewer levers. The scattered conclaves of that shadow empire have grown too used to answering only to their own conscience and their own terror. Guilliman can at best win over individual inquisitors, those few who still consider the survival of humanity as a whole to be more important than the purity of their own doctrines. He grants them resources, listens to their counsel when they speak of threats that only they can see, and hopes that they will in turn help to blunt the worst internal purges. He knows that elsewhere, in the dark between the stars, other inquisitors whisper his name with suspicion, seeing in his reforms a potential heresy. He cannot control them all. He can only hope that the wars they wage in secret do not intersect too catastrophically with the campaigns he must fight in the open. The greatest irony, the one that gnaws at him in his rare unarmored hours, is his role as jailer of a god corpse. Guilliman, architect of the original codex that broke the legions into chapters to avoid another heresy, had once envisaged an imperium of disciplined, rational warrior orders, guided by secular law and informed by cold assessment of reality. Now he presides over a theocracy that treats his father's ruined body as the centerpiece of a religion of sacrifice. He knows that the Golden Throne is not a seat of divine majesty, but a crippled life support engine, a cursed relic of desperate days when Malcador and the Mechanicum ripped open the fabric of old tech and warped law to keep a dying warlord alive because the alternative was unthinkable. He knows that the Astronomicon is not a holy beacon, but a psychic furnace fueled by countless souls. Yet, he must speak of these things in the language of sanctity, because to do otherwise would bring the entire edifice crashing down. He finds himself weaponizing symbols he personally distrusts. The image of terror, as inviolable heart of the Imperium, must be maintained, even though he has walked its cratered deserts and seen how vulnerable it truly is. The legend of the God Emperor's unerring guidance must be trumpeted, even though he has stood beside the Golden Throne and felt only the faint, agonized pressure of a mind stretched beyond endurance. Parades of shining Primaris Astartes, their armor polished to mirror brightness and their banners embroidered with litanies, march through the plazas of hive capitals, not merely to intimidate enemies, but to reassure allies. These warriors are not just fighters, they are living icons. The sight of them convinces billions of citizens and soldiers that someone, somewhere, is still in control. It is a lie, but it is a useful one. In the age of the Great Rift, faith and myth are as much strategic assets as void shields and titans. Guilliman understands this with the same cold clarity that his father once applied to genecraft and secular propaganda. The difference is that the Primarch remembers a time when the myths were smaller and more carefully managed. Now they have swollen into grotesque, self-sustaining entities that must be fed constantly with blood and narrative. He walks a narrow path, trying to harness them without being dragged behind them. Beyond the reach of any one man's reforms, the storms continue to build. Tyrannid tendrils arch deeper into imperial space with every passing campaign. Each engagement teaches the hive minds how to adapt, how to strip new biomes, how to crack new fortification patterns. Necron pharaons rouse forgotten armies and extend their null fields over star clusters, erasing warp routes and making whole regions effectively invisible to astropathic sight. Ork empires swell around. Charismatic warlords whose dreams of endless battle happen, by grim coincidence, to lead them towards sectors already buckling under other pressures. Chaos warbands, emboldened by the permanent wound in the sky, strike in patterns that no longer even pretend to obey old notions of front lines. The galaxy is not static. It is evolving, and it is doing so faster than the Imperium's ossified institutions can respond. Yet for all that, there are glimmers of a kind of hope, though Guilliman would never dare call it by that word in public. There are sectors reclaimed from disorder by the hammer blows of the Crusade, where tithes now flow again, and the torches of outright rebellion have been reduced to sullen coals. The realm of Ultramar, though scarred deeply by the plague wars, still stands as a beacon of relative order, its cities rebuilt, its armies once more drilled and equipped to a standard that would shame many other regions. New crusade groups have formed around charismatic commanders and cooperative chapters, alliances that bridge old rivalries in the face of common annihilation. In a few rare cases, even non-human allies have been courted in secret, their aid taken against threats that would have exterminated human and alien alike had pride been allowed to rule unchallenged. These scattered successes do not negate the enormity of the Imperium's predicament. They do, however, prove that mankind has not yet forgotten how to endure. The species is stubborn beyond reason. Hive worlds that should have emptied themselves of life under siege cling on through cannibalistic rationing and feral ingenuity. Forge worlds rearrange production schedules and strip sacred machine housings for parts, rather than allow a single crucial titan to fall silent. Naval officers with genealogies reaching back to the ancient fleets of the Great Crusade swallow their pride and accept commands from upstart Primaris admirals because there is no alternative. On the ground, battered guardsmen fix bayonets and stand their line again and again, not because they believe they will see a golden age, but because they refuse to hand their homes over to chittering horrors or laughing demons. In every decision he makes, Guilliman feels the edge of an impossible balance. Pushed too hard against the entrenched powers of terror, and he risks shattering the already cracked unity of the Imperium into warring faith states and rogue domains. Move too cautiously, and the slow rot of bureaucracy and dogma will continue to weaken every front line, ensuring that even the greatest victories become meaningless in the long term. Divert too many resources to one war zone, and others will fall. Spread them too thinly, and no battle will be won decisively enough to matter. The Primarch has always been a master of calculated risk. Now he is forced to gamble not with single campaigns, but with the fate of his entire species. In the end, the narrow path through apocalypse that he walks is not one that leads to salvation. It leads, if he succeeds, to delay. The best he can hope for is an Imperium that continues to exist, battered and bleeding, into future millennia, buying time with blood. The current problem of the Imperium is that there is no victory condition left that looks like peace. There is only the management of extinction, the extension of the species' lifespan by increments measured in worlds and generations of dead. Each war won is not an end, but the clearing of a space in which the next war can be fought. Each miracle of survival is another day bought against a universe that wants mankind erased. On 1,000,000 battlefields, under 1,000,000 polluted skies, men and post-human giants alike die screaming in the Emperor's name. Their deaths do not save humanity. They allow it to continue. That is the best the Imperium can offer them. In the age of the Dark Imperium, victory is not a shining dawn. It is the simple, brutal fact that there will still be human eyes left to watch another nightfall.